is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the third Sunday after the Epiphany for the week of January 25th, 2026, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to get into this week's podcast, and I am excited that we are coming back together. I don't know if you recognize this last week. I had to kind of pre-record a little bit, and especially if you've been in the United States, there's been a lot of kind of crazy, chaotic things that have been kind of going on lately. For me, I felt it was really interesting that that's what I ended up talking about. Just giving you forewarning on what I had talked about. I was talking a little bit about how the power of being acknowledged and seen, and talking about that whole psychology. And that was happening way before, it was recorded before everything that has gone on in Minneapolis. And so for me, I felt it was really interesting how God was just kind of naturally speaking through some of these texts. And I think, again, this shows yet again that these texts are living and breathing things. These are not things that are stagnant. These are things that continue to speak to us, continue to talk to us, and the Holy Spirit uses us to be able to utilize and talk through some of these difficult things that we're going through. And I think there's a lot of ways when we're looking at whether you're on one side or the other with everything that's going on, it's this recognition still how God is continuing to speak through these texts. And at minimum, we can recognize that there is parts where people are trying to acknowledge and be seen, and it's something that I think all of us continue to wrestle with and work with in our own lives. So let's get to the question that we had for last week, which was actually three questions, which were, who are you going to acknowledge? Who are you going to recognize? Who are you going to support this week? And we got a great answer this week from one of our loyal listeners, talking about how he does a really good job at looking for and being observant for people with kids and needing help with groceries or different things of that nature, in the aspect of being able to help them in the car or put their cart away or something of that nature. And I think this is something that in a lot of ways, this is a way that as Christians, we can separate ourselves in a very simple way, especially with our connection, we'll say, to technology. I think there's a lot of times that people miss things because we're so connected to our device and not connected to what's going on around us. And so there's this aspect of, at times we need to allow ourselves the ability to look out and be observant around us. And I think there's a lot of times and opportunities that we then can see, we then can help, we then can acknowledge, and allows for people to feel seen, to feel known, and actually allow us to have better connection with our community. It is interesting with how we have this master computer device that many of us, most everybody at least here in the United States, carries, and yet it causes us to struggle with connection. And its main purpose, in quotes, is designed to cause connection. And so I think there is this interaction that we have to be playing with and thinking about and working on responsibly handling, so that we have this better connection with our devices, so that they are actually causing and bringing forth connection instead of division. So let's just jump into it this week. And again, I feel like these texts here in this early Epiphany season is kind of continuing to build as we are getting into the beginnings of Jesus's ministry, and this is no different. So the Old Testament text this week is out of Isaiah chapter 9, the first 4 verses of it. This is a text that's here because it's going to be referenced in the gospel text this week. But the whole idea here is, again, the people of Israel are getting kind of tossed and turned around. There's just a lot of confusion, a lot of who is going to lead us? Has God abandoned us? And the famous verse here is verse 2. The people who walk in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in the land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. This way of acknowledging that there has been some difficult times, but things are going to get better. And it continues that then with verse 3 and verse 4, talking about how there'll be increased joy, there'll be multiplication of the harvest. There's this dividing of plunder, that the burdens of today become easier. This recognition on how God is going to continue to be with them and interact with them and work with them to be able to get through the different situations of the time. The psalm that goes with this week is Psalm 27, verse 1 and verses 4 through 9. This starts off with a very strong statement. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I be afraid? This recognition of what God then does. And so then we get verses 4 through 9 on how God then is continuing to seek us out, but then we have to be open to it. We shouldn't be hiding away. And I find it interesting because in my opinion, the psalmist is kind of phrasing it like, God, make sure that we're not doing this, but we also know that God doesn't do this. Do not hide me away. Do not conceal me. You lift up my head around my enemies. These ideas of how we are seeking the face of God and thus we should be doing these. And yet these are human characteristics that we put obstacles in the way, that we do these different things. And we get to this verse 9, do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger. You who have been my help, do not cast me out. Do not forsake me, O God, my salvation. This recognition on how this continued dependence on who God is, this continued dependence on us looking to and searching for and relying on God. Even though at times things may be difficult, even though when things around us are chaotic, that we continue to sing the melody of the Lord, and we continue to give praise to God, we continue to seek the face of God. The epistle text this week, or second reading, is out of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 through 18. And again, I feel that this is a really good text to be having in the way that the world has gotten around just faith in general. And I think this is a really important one, no matter where you're at. But it's this recognition here on how Paul talks about how in Christ there isn't these divisions that humans create. And he talks about how he is hearing that there are people saying, well, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, I belong to Christ. And then they get into this whole division that's there. And Paul gives this really kind of interesting side story here that he's so glad that he didn't baptize anyone outside of Cephas and Gatius, and then also talks about the house of Stevens, and he doesn't remember anyone else beyond that. We see a little bit of more of the human aspect here of Paul, but the recognition of what Paul is getting at is that this is supposed to be a proclamation of the gospel, not necessarily who baptized you. It's this recognition of when we are brought together in the fellowship of Christ, we are all together in it. We are all in the same boat. It is all of us. And I think that's one of the things as the Big C church we are struggling with, because at times between church denominations, we love drawing arbitrary lines. And this is kind of throwing salt at that. It's kind of throwing water at it and saying, no, we are all in the body of Christ together. We have to be able to work through this together as a body. And that it's what Christ did is what we are pursuing. It's that recognition of what Christ did and how that transformed us, and thus this then should be transformative within our own lives and allow us to live out our lives in a different way. The gospel text this week then is out of Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 to 23. This again is an interesting text we're continuing to build. We've skipped over the temptation of Jesus, but after all the support that Jesus has been getting, we then have the arrest of John. Jesus kind of withdraws and goes to his home in Capernaum, and he starts then laying out in verse 15 what we got in the Isaiah text at the beginning, and stating again that this great light is coming and the light is shining out. And this is a moment then where Jesus takes a different way. Jesus then repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. And then Jesus begins really his true ministry. He walks by the Sea of Galilee and has Simon, who is later called Peter, and his brother Andrew, who are casting nets, calls them in, follow me, for I will make you fishers of people. and they leave their nets and follow him. And again, we've also kind of covered this a little bit earlier. There has definitely already been relationship that has happened with Jesus and especially these two brothers at this point. He then also continues on and sees James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who are with their father mending nets. And he calls them, and immediately they leave their father, they leave the boat, and they follow Jesus. And then we get in verse 23, Jesus went throughout all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. This recognition on how the Jesus that we have been seeing in these first 3+ chapters is very different now suddenly. This is a huge turning point where John is now arrested. The path no longer can be blazed ahead of. Jesus now is the trailblazer and is taking on that royal highway to bring us into the next phase of Christ connecting with us and the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs. Working Preacher, if you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, different ways to be thinking about these texts, and having just the backlog of commentaries that they have on these different texts. I think it's an amazing resource. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having art, prayers, hymns, colors, going through the daily readings to help prepare you for worship. Whether you are going to be in front of the pews or in the pews, I think it's an amazing resource to be able to get so that you are able to connect deeper with our Creator week after week in the pews. And so if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend checking that out as well. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable or the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies, along with other ecological green news and things of that nature. So if you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy the resources over there. There are some great homilies that are going on over there week to week, just like this. And so it's an amazing resource that if you enjoy listening to this podcast week after week, I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. That'll be the first link down in the references section of the show notes. We have the change here of Jesus. The way that we anticipated and thought Jesus was operating, it very much appeared in these first 3+ chapters of Matthew of a more potentially cautious Jesus to a way. As we've talked about and discussed the last few weeks, there's definitely some indications of maybe more of his humanness, a little bit more of his hesitancy, a little bit more of, I guess this is the way that things have to be. And we recognize that John the Baptist is in a way leading them forward to be able to get to this place where Jesus, you need to do this. We've interacted, we've spent time together. I've known you for a long time. They're cousins. This recognition on Jesus, you gotta move forward. And John has been seen as this great prophet that is leading the people forward, but yet continues to turn and recognize Jesus. That's what we talked about last week. Now this changes dramatically. John is no longer there. And as we get later on, John will be killed. Jesus now recognizes that there isn't that person, that isn't that cheerleader naturally there. There isn't that person who's paving the way for him any longer. Jesus then references this stuff in Isaiah, stating that there have been waiting for this great light. The people who sit in darkness have seen a great light. And for those who are in the region and the shadow of death, light has dawned, coming from verse 16. This recognition on how this is the beginning of a new day. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me, coming from Michael Bublé, actually. But it's this recognition on how this is a turning of the page. This is a moving forward in a new way. This is a moving forward in a new direction. And we see that. Jesus takes a huge step forward and starting to get into what we think of Jesus's ministry. But it's also contrasted here, as we've seen now in these first 3+ chapters of Matthew, that there is this other side of Jesus. And for here, it seems like he almost turns on a switch and is suddenly this different character of Jesus that we are more familiar with. And it got me thinking a little bit of where else do we see this? And honestly, you probably see this every single day, but you don't recognize that you're seeing this. I think that's kind of fun. We're going to talk about wave-particle duality this week. And this is something that has been discussed and looked at for hundreds of years now. And we still aren't 100% sure how this works. But we have studied this multiple times to be able to recognize that this is what is happening. And this is hard for us because, as we talked about a few weeks ago, we talked about Newtonian physics. This opposes Newtonian physics. This is kind of the next part of physics we're going to talk about. And the easiest way of understanding this is starting with the double slit experiment. And so what this was is that we set up a card with 2 slits in it, and we're aim lasers at the slits, and that there is a space behind the slits, and we then would shine the lasers at the splits. And our understanding in our mind is if I shine a light through the slit, that it's going to then show up in a small beam where the slits were, that the light is going to go through there and it's going to then display and hit the wall behind it or whatever's behind it in a very controlled, here are the 2 slits, the rest of the light is being blocked. That isn't what happens. We start seeing these radiant of light that kind of goes in pulses, where there's stronger areas, lighter areas, places where it's dark, places where it's super bright, but it's not lining up perfectly with where the slits are. And what we start to recognize is what we are seeing and observing is that the particle of light, the electrons that we're sending through these slits, are acting as waves. Think of like sound waves or a wave off a boat where they kind of come out in concentric circles. And so thus what we're seeing is the places where they're coming together and amplifying, where the waves are at the same peak at the same time. You're getting also spots where they're countering each other and thus getting these areas where it nulls it out, or thus where it's not as intense. So then scientists are like, okay, well, if that's what's going on, can we observe and figure out exactly which slit is the electron or photon going through? And so they set up a camera to be able to distinctly see which slit the electron or photon is going through. And what happens is then it starts acting like what we initially expected, that there's these 2 particular slots and they're splattering themselves, and there's only 2 areas on where these light beams are suddenly appearing. And because now we're observing it and being very particular, suddenly we are seeing it act more as a particle versus a wave. And it's still something that we haven't truly been able to fully figure out. We can see, we observe it, we recognize it, but yet we aren't fully grasping what is going on. I see this as very similar to what Jesus is doing. Jesus makes these decisions, and suddenly the character of Jesus that we see in these first 3 chapters plus is suddenly very different than what we will see for most of the rest of the book. There's this complete shift. We have these expectations that we built off these first 3 chapters, and suddenly now Jesus is bolder, calling disciples, you're going to fish for people, we're going forward, we're doing this. It's very different. But what we also see is how Jesus does this ministry is also very different as we continue on than how John was doing it. He's still somewhat soft-spoken with how he interacts with the people and proclaims things, he'll make these statements, but he never says like, you have to believe this way. Whereas we even saw with John, this is the Son of God, follow him type of mentality. Jesus says, yeah, come and follow me, but it's up to you. There is no forcing of that. It's a little bit different way of looking at this. The other thing also is we're thinking about light and we're talking about light, and especially with where I'm at in the upper half of the northern hemisphere, northern half, we also can play around with that idea of light in particular. And we also know how, especially as you move further and further north, there has been more and more research talking about seasonal affect disorder, SAD, and how the lack of light affects us. We've also seen and talked about how artificial lights have hurt our own circadian rhythms and our natural cycles that our body uses for sleep and things of that nature, and how that can cause hard effects on our bodies, that because we're extending it further than what we were originally designed, because we were set to kind of follow a little bit of rising with the day and falling asleep at night type of rhythm. And how if we are removed from that natural light, it can be very difficult for our bodies to know what's going on, and that it needs to reacclimate to the light to be able to have these natural circadian rhythms. Is that not what we're also then potentially seeing a little bit in the Isaiah text, but also what Jesus is kind of reaffirming here? That as Jesus goes out, and Jesus is the light of the world and is going to go and share this light with the people, he is helping them reacclimate their circadian rhythms. He is helping them to be able to connect with that and refuel them. And especially having been around people who have this, they will say, I am not myself. And with the light therapy, with going to places where there is light, they feel this burden lifted. They feel themselves. They feel more alive. Is that not what we are doing here with Jesus trying to reconnect us, reawaken us to the divine, connecting us with the divine in a way, in a much deeper way than what we ever have before? And that's where, when you look at it then, like what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians, we find ways to try to create these artificial barriers. And what is that doing? It's preventing the light from being able to be shown as out to as many people. Anytime that you're putting a card or a wall or something, you are preventing the light from continuing out. We are really good at figuring out ways to build these different obstacles or put ourselves into these different boxes that prevent us from actually sharing that light and being that light out in creation, out in places that need it. We ask, like in the Psalm, for God not to hide God's face from us, but yet we hide our own face. We create these artificial walls. We create these things that make it so that we do not show our face. And yet, as we get in the affirmation in Isaiah, when we do walk in the light, the burden is lighter, the joy is more, the harvest is plentiful. We get lost in the sauce, we get lost in life, that we forget these things. We get intimidated by these things, that suddenly then we are not sharing our light. I feel that there is a certain aspect here that Jesus could have been discouraged. And that's a lot of what the presiding party was trying to do. They're trying to get rid of John. They're seeing him as the nuisance. Jesus really hasn't done anything to this point. Jesus isn't the concern. John is the concern. If we can snuff that out, it snuffs the whole thing. And the controlling party at that point, the kingdom, continues to be in the rule of the king. And Jesus does something unexpected. Jesus doesn't just fade away. Jesus doesn't act just like a typical particle. Suddenly Jesus is acting like a wave at this moment and starts to bring other people in. The moment that easily could have been, my biggest cheerleader is gone. What am I doing? Do I really need to pursue this? No. Jesus then takes the step that Jesus has been needing to, and John has been encouraging him to do. He goes out and does what Jesus was designed to do to bring us in closer relationship with God. We are the ones who set all these different barriers and obstacles. The human side of Jesus had even done that to this point. And suddenly now, with John being removed, the divine starts to appear and be shown much more through Jesus. As now we move into the ministry of Jesus. This is one of those moments that I feel like our understanding of how life works and how we are supposed to act and interact, we get surprised here by Jesus. And just like the two-slit test, it surprises us that it looks like it's acting both as a particle and as a wave. Jesus is now stepping into the divine character of God that we've only seen glimpses of to this point, specifically the baptism, and being called out to it, but not really showing it much to this point in Matthew's gospel. And then we have this and we see what this means and what does this do. And that's where Paul then is encouraging us. Then we need to continue to go and shine our light, not be hiding it away, not be figuring out ways to divide us, but unite us, because that light then is so much stronger. And it helps so many more people. Instead of figuring out ways to be dividing us, there's a lot of things that we should be working together to unite us. Helps take care of seasonal affect disorder, but I think also it helps, as we think about this, brings us together and unites us together in our being. Because we all know that there is a part of us that does long to connect with the divine, whether we fully acknowledge it yet or not. And if we see that light is something that is naturally needed within our bodies to help us regulate our circadian rhythms, but also seems to affect us when it's being taken away from us, I think there is something there, that there is a desire within us. There's something within us that wants to connect with the light, that wants to be in relationship with the light. We don't know what light is until the darkness comes, but there's this recognition that we can't always be in the darkness. We need to pursue the light. And I think that's something important as well. I think understanding some of these properties of light and how it affects our body is something that is really important. And so I think the question for us this week is, how does light affect you? How does light affect you? Because I think it is necessary. I think it is something that we really need. And it's something that I think we chase after, being able to create artificial light so that we can extend and try to go a little bit further, go a little bit more. But I think there is this aspect where, are we really spending the time to connect with the light, or are we just using the light? Because that's something different. Jesus invites his disciples to come and follow him. He's inviting them into relationship. He wants to be part of it with them, not apart from them. And I think that's something that we have to wrestle with, we have to think about, we need to consider. And I think it's something important for us to continue to ponder in this Epiphany season of how are we going to consider and look for and pursue the light of Christ in our lives. And what does that actually mean for us as we move forward? So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.